You're listening to the Valley Labor Report with David Story and Jacob Morrison.
This is an interview that I'm incredibly excited about. I think it intersects really nicely with the purpose of this show and the national conversation about racism that was spurred by the murder of George Floyd in late May. Of course, due to the circumstances of his death, a lot of the conversation around has centered around the obvious racism in policing and the criminal justice system. But of course, racism exists elsewhere too, and it raises the obvious question about how to work to combat that in a lot of different scenarios. Rarely talked about in the popular discourse, unfortunately, is the role that labor unions can play, have played, and ought to play in combating racism both systemically and interpersonally. Dr. Jake Grumbach, a researcher at the University of Washington, along with his colleague Paul Freimer from Princeton, hope to not only discuss these things but prove what the effects of unions has been on racial resentment of members quantitatively. I think this is incredibly important work, and Jake, I appreciate you taking your time to talk to us about this today.
Absolutely. Great to be on with you guys.
Thank you. So the fact that union membership decreasing interpersonal racism among members, the fact that it decreases racial resentment, this is a phenomenon that really any organizer worth their salt could tell you that because they've experienced it firsthand. And it makes intuitive sense, when you're because membership in a union necessitates having very hard and intimate conversations about things like pay, health care, whether to go on strike or not, and having these conversations often. So it makes sense that this increased personal exposure would decrease racial resentment, but you've gone a step further and attempted to put this phenomenon in hard numbers. Before we get too far into the broader conversation about racism and labor unions, I'd like to dig in a little bit on your study. So could you tell us how you're defining racial resentment, how you're finding the degree to which folks have this racial resentment, and how you're measuring the effect that union membership plays on this?
That sounds great. I think that was a great summary of the sort of issues at hand in the paper. So racial resentment is a way in surveys that social scientists use to try to detect racism in the public. And it's really actually hard to find racism in the public in surveys because of what's called social desirability bias. And you can understand this, that when somebody calls you on the phone and asks you various questions, if they're asking you questions about, do you believe black people are innately inferior to white people? Not many people are going to answer that. Even the ones that believe that are not going to answer it truthfully because it's embarrassing. So racial resentment as a measure is another way that essentially asks questions whether people believe racial inequality is based on institutional racism, long-term racism, the legacy of slavery and segregation and beyond, or it's due to sort of personal defects, laziness among black people and people of color. So that's there's a big debate actually in psychology, political science, and sociology, other disciplines about how to measure racism, but that's one main popular way. And then what we find, we do a lot of work statistically to try to show what, like you said, what labor organizers have known for a long time, and really also what historians and other qualitative scholars have known for a long time, which is that unions have played a big role in producing a sort of interracial, solidarity-based labor movement. And we try to show this statistically, and it's really important when you do this statistically to try to show that it's actually labor unions making people less racist rather than other characteristics of them that are just happen to be related to labor unions, that it's actually the labor union membership doing it. So we put in a lot of work to do that.
Right. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that work, because I think that there are some variables that people can think of that would make union members different than non-union members. For example, geography. There are more union members in New York and California, let's say, than in Alabama. We can also think about private sector versus public sector. Public sector workers tend to be more unionized than private sector workers, and the public sector also has a larger degree. To my knowledge, there are more people of color working in the public sector. So, how do you get those confounding variables out in your study?
Yeah. You should come be a professor in my department. That you're asking exactly the right questions. So the point here is that I think the point's about geography. So there are more union members in places where we'd maybe expect less racial resentment. Industries like teaching are more unionized, and people that become teachers tend to be, interested in these sort of anti-racism issues more than the average person. But what we do is we use what's called panel data, where you look across time at the same people. So you have them before, you can ask them questions before they were labor union members, and then after, once they become labor union members, and see the change. And that protects statistically against what you're suggesting, like confounders. So not only do we do things like statistically control for geography and for income and things like that, but we look at this panel data to try to see across time whether becoming a union member changes you. And that's a lot more effective than trying to compare otherwise similar people who are and are not labor union members.
Right. And
then we did a lot of work to establish that it wasn't other stories. So labor unions provide people better job security, and labor union members get paid higher wages than non-labor union members. It could just be, that people feel a little more economically comfortable when they have a solid middle-class union job than a more precarious job otherwise. But we show that it's not the income that's doing this. It's actually being a labor union member and being part of a labor union.
Right, and you mentioned that you use this panel data that looks at people over time, and not only does that remove the confounding variables of geography, public sector versus private sector, but that also works to decrease the amount of what you called social desirability bias, that a person is not going to tell you, right, that I hate black people, right? No one's going to say that in a study, but you can measure the social desirability bias is going to be the same before and after a person joins the union, right? Say the social desirability bias is like +1. I am like +1, not a racist, right? To whatever the base, whatever you actually are, you add +1 to your not racist score, right? Well, if you have an original not racist score of 2, and then when you join the union you have a not racist score of 3 or 4, then the delta is going to be the same whether or not you are having this social desirability bias. And I think that the data that you have in your study and the work that you've done to reduce these biases and confounding variables is really robust and laudatory.
Thanks. So that's like these days in the social sciences and the quantitative social sciences, there's a lot of talk about, the politics of higher education in the U.S., whether professors are too liberal or whatnot. But there are such strict rules and sort of thresholds you have to reach to demonstrate a statistical finding that's real. They really, when you put a paper into a scientific journal and get it through peer review, they are looking for any potential reason you're actually wrong. So you have to build these really, really robust demonstrations that you found something. It's a little overboard, actually, but it does show once you get this through that what you found statistically is real.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, a lot of people, like you said, they talk about how, social science professors are very liberal, they're very loose with their studies, and they just say what they want to say. And I think that hearing from you about the things that you're doing to reduce the amount of personal bias that's going in from you and reducing the amount of confounding variables that are just found naturally in the world, I think that may help people kind of understand the amount of work that actually goes into stuff like this, because there's real serious work and it takes a lot of time to do this kind of stuff.
Exactly. No, way too much time. No, it's actually
How long did this study take you to do?
Researchers. So we wrote it over maybe 6 months, the first real package of it, and then you send it to a journal. This was actually remarkably fast from my experience, and then it came back through peer review. In another 3 months, you get reviews that say you need to change these, and we're not convinced on these things. So One reviewer actually asked about right-to-work states and non-right-to-work states and thought that actually, the effect of union membership might be different in non-right-to-work states where people, are more, have more ways to just not avoid joining unions sometimes. And but actually, then we did additional analysis.
Right, yeah, we're going to talk about that on the other side. Stay tuned.
Now listen, lonely tumor inside my... Let's go! Hey! Walking through a wasteland, under darkened skies, in a land built upon a foundation of lies, pointed up structures and disintegrations.
Good morning and welcome back, folks. This is the Valley Labor Report. My name is Jacob Morrison, here with my co-host David Story. On the line, we have Professor Jake Grumbach from the University of Washington. He's talking to us about his study that has that has attempted to show quantitatively the effect on racial resentment that labor unions have on their members. And so when we left off, you were talking about right-to-work states versus non-right-to-work states. So I just want to let you kind of flesh out that thought.
Yeah, just basically in the social science peer review process, they make you demonstrate that it could not possibly be any other reason for why you're finding the statistics you're finding. One could have been right-to-work states. One could have been we have too many professionals, like teachers and nurses unions in our sample, things like that. We did extra work in the appendices to demonstrate that was not the case, and really we're finding that labor unions make workers less racially resentful, less racist, more interested in interracial solidarity for sort of working-class politics.
Right. So when we talked earlier, kind of doing the debrief before the interview, you mentioned that this study is very temporally bound, right? This is not your results are not going to be true throughout all of history. And in fact, for people that know much at all about labor history, they know that labor unions, especially the American Federation of Labor, at the turn of the 20th century, was a very racist organization. They had segregated unions, white-only unions, black-only unions. They fought very hard for restrictionist immigration policies. They were very demeaning to immigrants and immigrant labor, and so. But then there came a change in the labor movement with the CIO and other more interracial solidarity movements like the CIO, like the IWW stuff in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. So can you talk about kind of the role that the labor movement has played in racial politics throughout the 20th and 21st century and how it's changed?
Yeah, that's exactly right. From the AFL, which was a sort of artisanal craft union where they really fought hard for the Chinese Exclusion Act and were an all-white union. But that changed, and by the 20s and 30s, some majority white unions like the CIO and the IWW were actually really pushing for civil rights to go hand in hand with labor politics. And they started articulating something that a sort of theory that goes back to at least W.E.B. Du Bois in the early 20th century, but the idea that racism is a tool of the ruling class to divide workers and the working class and prevent solidarity and working class power to get their due. So by the 20s and 30s, the IWW and CIO were really pushing in that direction, and then this became a huge phenomenon in the UAW in the 1950s and 60s under Walter Reuther. And you can see Walter Reuther marching in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Martin Luther King's March on Washington. You can see him walking in the front with fellow sort of union leaders like A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a black union. And that was when they knew at the time it was very clear that the labor movement was going to be a part of the civil rights movement. And they knew that, again, racism is dividing working class people all the way to now where the AFL-CIO is very clearly has anti-racist messaging the leaders make speeches against racism in politics and elsewhere and say, keep your eyes on the prize. We need working class solidarity. When we're divided by race or gender or sexual orientation or really any of these sort of identity or cultural dimensions, that is a tool of the powerful, of the ruling class, to divide us.
Right. What do you think it was? What do you think it was that made union leaders and the rank and file in the 20s and 30s, when this started becoming more apparent? What do you think it was that what was the light bulb moment, right? Because for so long, unions had, like we said, unions had played into this racial division, native versus immigrant worker division. And so what was the light bulb moment that made them see that, oh, this is like not in our interests to like not like immigrant workers or not like black workers. This is not in our interest. It will be more in our interest if we all work together. What was that light bulb moment?
Yeah, I think there's two potential explanations in union leaders' minds. One's the more sort of strategic, cynical answer, which is still cool, which is that they saw, okay, there's an increased number of black industrial workers coming to, for example, northern cities in the Great Migration by the 1930s, and the Depression was on, and to keep labor unions powerful and expand their power, they would try to create interracial labor unions to expand their memberships. That's one reason. Another is this more just principle-based reason that you see very clearly that divisions based on race are going to hurt class politics and really just economic justice for people in the U.S., period.
Right. And you also mentioned when we were talking earlier about the role that that the labor movement and organized labor has played in partisan politics. And you mentioned during this period, we can call it like a renaissance, or it wasn't like a renewing necessarily, but like this really powerful interracial solidarity movement within organized labor, within the House of Labor, that really brought people together. And in the 50s and 60s, we had nearly 30-something% of workers unionized, and so there was this very strong class politics, and that has kind of been switched for something else. Can you tell us what that was and how that switch happened in the partisan political landscape?
So since the 1970s, labor union density, labor union membership has declined, massively. And this was intentional, right, by, politicians and corporate forces really didn't want workers to be organized, and they got major businesses got really involved in politics by the late 70s and onwards. They helped to crush labor unions, for example, in the 1980s. As labor unions were diminishing, then this labor power was less evident in politics. And what replaced it was strategic on the part of some of these politicians who wanted people to not focus on labor issues, not threaten their corporate power to get paid higher wages and have better health care and job security. They wanted people to focus on cultural resentment issues and identity resentment issues. So after the 1980s, we saw the increase of this sort of cultural backlash politics, for example, and we see that now. So it's clear statistically, again, if you're in political science and you do these statistics, you can tell more about how somebody's going to vote based on how they feel about Colin Kaepernick than you can based on how they feel about health care and the minimum wage and class policies, economic policies like that. We're in a moment where politics is overwhelmingly cultural and about cultural resentment, that we really dislike certain people we see on TV, and we hope we can elect people that, talk trash on those people who we dislike on TV. And that has replaced sort of solidarity-based labor politics to the detriment of working class people. And since the 70s, we've seen a huge rise of it. We've seen the middle class stagnate, where there's been no new wealth for the middle class, and yet the sort of billionaire class has swollen its wealth, many times since over the past generation. And that's not an accident. That was part of destroying the labor movement.
Right. That and I think that people don't really recognize the extent to which both of the major parties really do this. They want to talk about these cultural issues rather than talking about the bread and butter issues about health care, wages, retirements, pensions, because it's so much easier to paint Black Lives Matter on a street than it is to actually reform the police department. It's so much easier for Trump to say, that Kaepernick is an SOB than it is for him to do anything at all materially for his base. And so that's a really important thing to realize when we're talking about these types of cultural versus class politics. We're going to do one more segment with Jake. This is the Valley Labor Report. Stay tuned.
Charge upon the land, a population burned up, bled dry. The marginalized multiply and unite to fight. You vacant the world, rather tearing you apart. The soil you held sacred now blackened with.
Good morning and welcome back to the Valley Labor Report. My name is Jacob Morrison, here with my co-host David Story. On the line, we've got Professor Jake Grumbach from the University of Washington. He recently authored a study in the American Journal of Political Science. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, talking about the effects of union membership on racial resentment among members, and so we've been talking to him about that. It's very, very. The study is very robust. If you missed the first parts of the interview, you can go back and watch it on YouTube. We'll have it up early next week. And so where we left off, we were talking about how identity politics in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party has kind of replaced a sort of class politics that the labor movement was very active in creating in the middle of the 20th century. And so was there any other thoughts that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah. No, I just thought before the break you summarized it really nicely. So there's a couple things to highlight in what you said. One is that so there's sort of two versions of identity politics going on and sort of cultural resentment politics. One is at least the Democratic Party establishment really likes symbolic gestures about anti-racism, anti-homophobia, and sort of anti-misogyny messaging without much material backing to it. So, for example, a policy like Medicare for all or higher minimum wage or stronger labor power for unions, that would help. That would certainly help African Americans and other people of color in the U.S. tremendously, but those don't appear on the agenda as much as some symbolic policies sometimes. On the Republican side, you have, I think Donald Trump encapsulates this best, where the sort of stereotype we have in our head is that his base is the white working class former union member, like a out of work coal miner, whereas his policies in office have been nothing but giving red meat to the billionaire class, massive high-end tax cuts and other things like that. And what he has done strategically really well is cause people to vote based on cultural resentment and a sort of white identity politics rather than look at the policies, look at his attempts to cut health care and wages and transfer a ton of money upward to the billionaire class.
Right, and again, you mentioned in your paper... Oh, what were you saying?
Yeah, the decline of labor movements is just key in this.
Right, and you mentioned in your paper that W.E.B. Du Bois called the phenomenon of white workers being pro-slavery despite the fact that it decreased their free labor, the white workers' labor, because they're competing with free labor. And so today we kind of have a psychological wage where people are voting for Trump so that he can make the right people angry rather than actually make their lives materially better. I don't think it's exactly the same. It's a little different, but it's still a psychological wage. No, you're not actually, your life is not getting better. You're just experiencing Schadenfreude because because
exactly.
like,
You don't get, your health care is cut and you lose your job, but at least you own the lib.
Right.
Am I right?
Right. That's exactly right. So, we're talking about this as if it's the implication is that this is bad. It is bad that identity politics has taken over from a class politics that the labor movement helped to invigorate in the middle of the 20th century. And so, as somebody who I don't think you primarily see yourself as like a union activist. I think you primarily see yourself as like a researcher, an academic, somebody like that. But so and I'm assuming you're in the union at the University of Washington, but as somebody who's nominally on the outside, like this isn't like what you think about day in and day out, what would you tell labor leaders to do to reinvigorate that class politics and try to shift the conversation from these cultural, psychological wages to to real wages, to real material benefits for working people?
So I do think, to some extent, labor unions are doing the right thing. So we found as evidence sort of some of these solidarity-based trainings that unions do, and some of this has declined. So the AFL-CIO used to have sort of larger organizer and steward trainings than they do now. There's things the labor union can double down on. I love the idea of more small d democratic unions where the rank and file has a greater voice, all of that. But again, I'm not on the ground. I have family history in the labor movement and personally have dabbled in working with unions, but you're right, I'm on the outside, so I'm trying to get this. Basically, what I did was help to statistically demonstrate, I think, what a lot of labor organizers knew, but I'm looking for both you guys and organizers on the ground for insights about sort of the next big push. But I would say for political candidates, really thinking that if you are interested in voting or running for office and things like that, there's a tension often you hear, either focus on anti-racism or focus on class politics like unions. However, that's a false choice that actually, if you think about, it's really the idea of race and class together is the fundamental building blocks of sort of U.S. struggle and politics. And the labor movement combines those to build a robust sort of class politics for everybody and interracial solidarity that can really build a stronger middle class.
That's exactly that's. I completely agree with that. And you mentioned something about more small d democratic unions. And this is something that Jane McAlevey really pushes in her books. And it makes a lot of sense. Making a union more small d democratic, where it's practicable, which is in a lot of areas, is just almost like a silver bullet for so many issues. It's a silver bullet for corruption. If members have more control over their leaders, the leaders are not going to be corrupt. One of the reasons that the UAW was able to become so corrupt at the top is because the people at the top removed a lot of the checks and balances the membership had on them. So if you increase democracy in unions, if you increase the ability of members to have a say over the way that their unions are run, then you obviously decrease corruption, but you're going to help make the unions more of an anti-racist union because it's not in the interest of the workers to be racist. So that's definitely a really good thing that I think that a lot of good organizers would agree with. We've got a couple of minutes left in the interview, so could you just tell us kind of you alluded to it a little bit, but tell us what made you want to do this study? What made you want to look into this?
So I've long been interested in these issues of sort of race and class together. But personally, so my grandfather, my mom's dad was a newspaper editor for black newspapers like the Michigan Chronicle and then the Chicago Defender in the mid-century. And he was on sort of the labor beat and was really interested in integrating labor unions to become an interracial force for the working and middle class in places like Chicago and Detroit. So that was a powerful influence. Moving forward, just in my childhood, growing up in a city, seeing people without health insurance, seeing just the need for thinking about race and class together, all the way to interning for the union Unite Here, which is a mostly hotel and some restaurant workers unions out on the West Coast. all of those really informed my interest in this, yeah. And again, we just do, in political science and social science, we do a tremendous amount of sort of work on people's psychology and how they vote and things like that. There's not enough work quantitatively on the role of labor unions.
Right. Yeah, well, Jake, I appreciate your time today. This has been a really interesting, illuminating interview about the way that labor unions affect racial resentment among their members. I think that our audience is really going to enjoy listening to it. And like I said, if you missed part of it, it's going to be on our YouTube channel. You can search YouTube for the Valley Labor Report, and we'll throw this segment up later. Jake, where can folks find you?
People can find me on Twitter at Jake M. Grumbach. Or Google me, Jake Grumbach, and you can, say hi if you'd like.
All right, Professor, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Stay tuned. This is the Valley Labor Report. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate your time. If you want to see what we're up to throughout the week and get our snide quips about the news of the day, then you should follow us on social media. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Valley Labor Report. We're on Twitter at Labor Reporters. I'm on Twitter at JacobM_AL. David is on Twitter at Radical Unionist. That's spelled RADICL Unionist. If you missed part of the show and want to go back and watch it later, search YouTube for The Valley Labor Report and subscribe to our channel. You can go back and watch the full show there, and we also clip segments throughout the week. And we also upload the program on more than 11 different podcasting apps. So you can see if we're on your listening platform of choice. You can go to thevalleylaborreport.transistor.fm/subscribe. And if you appreciate our work and want to help us stay on the air, then consider throwing us a couple dollars a month on patreon.com/The Valley Labor Report.